Hi, thank you for joining me again. I'm going to be doing a multi-part series here on Dr. Core's Curriculum Explainers, talking about testing and test scores and what is the rhetoric around test scores. I'm going to keep these short and sweet if it's at all possible to do so because there's a lot of complex ideas that need to be broken down in order to make sense of this. So this is installment number 1, and I think there'll be 3 or 4, but we'll see how that goes. Today we're going to be talking about the Simpson's paradox. Not that Simpson's paradox, but Simpson's paradox. So, Simpson's paradox is a weird statistical phenomenon that comes into play when there appears to be a trend in the data that shows one thing, but if you break it apart to compare apples to apples within the data, then you actually see a reverse trend. Now that's kind of complicated, and so I want to break that down a bit. So in 1983, when Nation at Risk is being produced and published, what happens is you've got several kinds of researchers looking at data. They're looking at data of SAT scores in the early 1980s compared to 20 years before in the 1960s. And what they identify is that there are declining SAT scores across the board. So this leads to this educational panic that is engendered by an already biased view that America's competitiveness is slipping. So what happens is they're looking at the whole trend, but when an analysis was redone 7 years later, you saw that when you broke up the data by demographics, that the trend actually showed that SAT scores were improving. Well, how could this be? Well, if you stop and think a moment about who was going to university or who was applying to go to university in the 1960s compared to the 1980s, you have a much more diverse group. You have many more women, many more immigrants, many more low-income folks now have access to universities and to SATs, which over that intervening period, there's much more emphasis on getting a much broader range of students applying to universities and taking SATs. So what we see is that we are making a comparison between apples and oranges as if they were both apples. But instead, what we see is that among those groups where you had low scores in the 1960s, they were very small and had very little effect on the data. In the 1980s, they have a much bigger effect on the overall data, leading to declining or the appearance of declining scores. But if you look at just that same sample group across that period of time, you actually see improvements in that demographic. This is kind of what is happening with PISA scores when we're looking at Alberta's performance. We'll go into that in another episode. But for now, it's important to recognize that the way we look at data and the way we look at statistics needs to be put in context and can't just be looked at overall if we're to understand the true and actual trends that are occurring.